Picture a man sitting in a modest Manhattan office, duct tape holding the worn carpet together, boxy 1990s computers humming on cluttered desks, and a view of Central Park that nobody really had time to enjoy. There is nothing in that room that looks like the staging ground for the single most audacious financial attack in modern history. And yet, on the morning of September 16th, 1992, from inside those unremarkable walls, one man and a small team of analysts quietly put into motion a plan that would bring the British government to its knees, drain billions from the country's reserves, crash the value of the pound sterling, and net its architect over $1 billion in a single day. His name was George Soros. And what he did that Wednesday, what history would come to call Black Wednesday, was not a crime. It was not fraud. It was not manipulation in any legal sense. It was something arguably more troubling than all of those things combined. It was the moment a private citizen, armed with a philosophy, a theory of markets, and the nerve to bet everything on it, defeated an entire sovereign government in open combat. It was the moment the world learned, in no uncertain terms, that the era of governments controlling economies might be ending, and that a new, far more ruthless era, one governed by markets, by capital flows, by hedge funds and speculators, was only just beginning. This is the story of how it happened, not just the trade, but everything behind it, the childhood that forged the man, the philosophy that forged the strategy, the broken architecture of European finance that created the opportunity, the colossal political miscalculations that handed Soros the weapon, and the devastating human cost that nobody talks about when they tell the story of the trade of the century. He was born György Schwartz in Budapest, Hungary on August 12, 1930. His father, Tivadar, was a Jewish lawyer who had already survived imprisonment as a Russian prisoner of war during the First World War. His mother's family ran a silk store. By the standards of their community, they were comfortable, relatively prosperous, and largely assimilated into Hungarian society. By 1936, the family had changed their surname from the unmistakably Jewish Schwartz to the ambiguous palindromic Soros, a protective adaptation in a country where anti-Semitism was not a fringe ideology, but a creeping feature of daily life. That adaptation, the ability to read a threatening environment and transform oneself to survive it, would become the most formative lesson of George Soros's life. In March 1944, Nazi Germany invaded and occupied Hungary. It was one of the most brutal and sudden phases of the Holocaust. Within weeks, the machinery of deportation began rolling. Over the following months, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz. Tivadar Soros, a man who had already survived one catastrophe through ingenuity and nerve, understood instantly what was happening. He did not freeze. He acted. He obtained false identity papers, not just for his own family, but for dozens of people around them. He split the family up, concealing them under different false identities, farming them out to different safe houses around Budapest. Young György, 14 years old, was hidden as the godson of a Christian Hungarian official. He watched the deportations. He saw what happened to people who were caught, who hesitated, who were too slow to adapt. And he survived. Later in life, Soros would say that his father taught him the art of survival, that the capacity to remain calm, read situations accurately, and act decisively when others were paralyzed was not a character flaw, but the most essential human skill there was. By 1946, with Soviet communism now sweeping across Eastern Europe and replacing one form of authoritarianism with another, Tivadar recognized the same warning signs all over again. György slipped out of Hungary to attend an Esperanto youth congress. His father had raised him speaking the language and did not go back. He made his way to London. 17 years old, penniless, working as a railway porter, then as a nightclub waiter, scraping together just enough to attend the London School of Economics. And it was there, in the lecture halls of one of the world's most prestigious institutions, that György Schwartz, now going by George Soros, encountered the man whose ideas would, indirectly, one day break the Bank of England. His name was Karl Popper, and he was one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. Popper's central preoccupation was with the nature of knowledge, how we know what we know, and more importantly, how we know when we're wrong. His concept of falsifiability argued that a theory is only scientific if it can, in principle, be proven false. A theory that can explain everything, that can never be contradicted by any conceivable evidence, is not a scientific theory at all. It is a belief system dressed up in intellectual clothing. Popper extended this thinking to political philosophy. His book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, argued that any ideology which claimed to have a final complete truth, whether fascism, Marxism, or any form of totalitarianism, was inherently dangerous, because it was not open to the correction that reality constantly demands. The Open Society, in contrast, was one that remained permanently uncertain, permanently open to revision, permanently humble about its own limitations. For a young man who had watched two totalitarian certainties, Nazi anti-Semitism and Soviet communism, grind millions of people into dust, this was not abstract philosophy. It was viscerally personal. Popper's framework of fallibility, the idea that every participant in a system holds an incomplete, distorted view of reality, became the foundation of everything Soros would later do. But Soros did something that Popper never quite intended. He applied this framework to financial markets. Most economists, in the mid-20th century and even today, operate under some version of the efficient markets hypothesis, the idea that prices in financial markets already reflect all available information, that the collective intelligence of millions of buyers and sellers produces something close to objective truth. In this view, it is essentially impossible to consistently beat the market over time, because any deviation from fair value is quickly corrected by the rational actions of rational participants. Soros thought this was nonsense. Not wrong in a minor technical sense, but fundamentally catastrophically wrong in its understanding of human nature. He developed what he called the theory of reflexivity. The core insight was elegant and devastating. Market prices, he argued, do not simply reflect reality, they also shape it. And the participants who move those prices are not rational automatons processing perfect information. They are fallible human beings whose views of the world are always partial, always distorted by bias, always filtered through what they already believe. These distorted perceptions lead to distorted actions, which create distorted outcomes, which then feed back and reinforce or undermine the original perceptions. A continuous self-referential loop between belief and reality. In the pound trade, this loop would play out in almost textbook fashion. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Soros graduated from the London School of Economics in 1952. He spent years grinding through the merchant banking world of London, where the networks were nepotistic and opportunities for Hungarian Jewish immigrants were limited. He eventually landed a position at Singer and Friedlander, a small merchant bank, through the good graces of a Hungarian managing director who recognized a fellow countryman. It was entry-level, unglamorous work, but it was a foot in the door. In 1956, he made his move to America, sailing to New York to take a job at a small brokerage firm on Wall Street. Over the next decade, he worked his way through several firms, carving out a niche as one of the few analysts on Wall Street who deeply understood European securities, a niche that became enormously valuable as European markets expanded after the formation of the European coal and steel community. By the 1960s, Soros was managing money, picking stocks, thinking not just about individual companies, but about the macroeconomic forces, interest rates, currency dynamics, political shifts that shaped entire markets. In 1969, he launched his own hedge fund. It was initially called Double Eagle, and it had $12 million in assets under management. The fund would eventually be renamed the Quantum Fund, a name deliberately drawn from the uncertainty principle of quantum physics. The idea, deeply resonant with Soros's theory of reflexivity, that the very act of observing a system changes it. Over the next decade, the Quantum Fund returned 3,365% to investors. For context, the S&P 500 index returned 47% over the same period. By the standards of financial history, this was not just success. It was dominance so complete it bordered on the inexplicable. Except it was not inexplicable at all. It was the product of a philosophy, relentlessly applied. The ability to identify moments when market perceptions had diverged so dramatically from reality that the correction, when it came, would be violent and one-directional. And by 1992, Soros and his team had identified perhaps the greatest such divergence in the history of modern currency markets. The divergence had a name. It was called the exchange rate mechanism, and it was, from almost every angle one could look at it, a catastrophe waiting to be triggered. To understand what was about to happen, you need to understand what the ERM was and why Britain ended up trapped inside it like a fly in amber. The exchange rate mechanism had been created by the European Economic Community in 1979. The underlying logic was straightforward. Europe's member economies were deeply interconnected through trade. Violent swings in currency values between those economies created chaos. A French company might sign a year-long supply contract with a German manufacturer, only to find that shifts in the franc-to-mark exchange rate had wiped out their profit margins before a single shipment arrived. The ERM was designed to prevent that kind of volatility by requiring member countries to keep their currencies within a defined band of values relative to each other, and to a basket of currencies called the European Currency Unit. The anchor of the system was the German Deutsche Mark. Germany's economy was the largest and most stable in the bloc. Its central bank, the Bundesbank, had an ironclad constitutional mandate to maintain price stability above all other considerations, a mandate born directly from the trauma of the catastrophic hyperinflation of the 1920s, which had obliterated savings, destabilized society, and helped create the conditions for Hitler's rise. The Bundesbank did not bow to political pressure. It set rates based on what was right for the German economy, and other ERM members had no choice but to follow. Britain, for most of the 1980s, stayed out of the ERM, Margaret Thatcher was profoundly skeptical of ceding monetary policy control to a European framework dominated by Germany. Her instinct, which would prove prescient, was that tying the pound to the Deutsche Mark was an attempt to buck the market, and that if you tried to buck the market would eventually buck you back. But by 1990, Thatcher's position was weakening. The British economy in the late 1980s had experienced a spectacular boom, boosted by tax cuts, surging house prices, and low interest rates. But the boom had overheated. Inflation had climbed above 10%. In that context, the Treasury's view was that joining the ERM would function as an external discipline, forcing the British government to maintain tight monetary policy in order to keep the pound within its ERM band. It would be, in the now famous phrase, a way to have monetary discipline imposed from without. In October 1990, in the dying days of her premiership, Margaret Thatcher agreed. Britain joined the ERM. The exchange rate was set at 2.95 Deutsche Marks per pound, a rate that even the president of the Bundesbank at the time, Karl Popper, privately told the British Chancellor was too high and should be negotiated down. The British said no. They locked in that rate, and they did so at what was already the beginning of a new recession. 7 weeks after Britain joined the ERM, Thatcher was gone. John Major became Prime Minister, and he inherited a commitment he would defend with everything he had, not because the economics necessarily supported it, but because his political credibility was now irrevocably tied to it. The pound in the ERM at 2.95 marks was John Major's center of gravity. To abandon it would be to admit catastrophic failure. The trap had been set. Now add the element that transformed a structural misalignment into an active crisis. In 1990, Germany reunified. The Berlin Wall had fallen the previous year, and Helmut Kohl, the West German Chancellor, made a decision of historic generosity and historic economic recklessness simultaneously. He agreed to convert East German Ostmarks to West German Deutsche Marks at a 1-to-1 ratio. This was politically understandable. It gave East Germans immediate economic dignity. But the Ostmark was worth a tiny fraction of the Deutsche Mark in real purchasing power. Overnight, the German government had essentially printed enormous sums of money into the East German economy. The result was predictable. Inflation rose in Germany. The Bundesbank, doing exactly what its mandate required, raised interest rates aggressively to contain it. By 1992, German interest rates were among the highest in the developed world, and because other ERM members had to keep their currencies roughly stable against the Deutsche Mark, they had to follow the Bundesbank's rates upward, even if doing so made absolutely no sense for their own economies. For Britain, this was a slow-motion disaster. The country was already in recession. Unemployment, which had been 7.1% in 1990, had climbed to 9.9% by 1992. GDP growth had averaged negative 0.2% from 1990 to 1992. The housing market, which had boomed so spectacularly in the late 1980s, was now in collapse. House prices were falling, repossessions were rising. Families across Britain were trapped in negative equity, owing more on their mortgages than their homes were worth, while the high interest rates needed to maintain the pound's ERM position made their monthly payments even more crushing. The normal response to a recession is to cut interest rates. Lower rates make borrowing cheaper. They encourage investment and spending. They give the economy room to breathe. But cutting rates would push the pound below its ERM floor. And cutting rates would mean breaking the commitment that John Major had staked his government on. So while the British people suffered through unemployment, falling home values, and rising mortgage payments, the government's hands were tied. The economic policy appropriate for the actual state of the British economy was simply not available to them. This is what George Soros and his team were looking at in the spring of 1992. And what they saw was not a subtle imbalance or a minor misalignment. They saw a government making a promise that reality would inevitably force it to break. And they saw that the only question was not whether the pound would have to leave the ERM, but when. The man who actually crystallized the trade was not Soros himself, but his remarkably talented portfolio manager, Stanley Druckenmiller. Druckenmiller had joined the Quantum Fund in 1988, and he and Soros formed one of the most formidable partnerships in the history of finance. Druckenmiller, with his extraordinary ability to analyze macroeconomic situations from the ground up, building a mosaic from thousands of data points, and Soros, with his almost preternatural confidence in sizing positions once the analysis was clear. Druckenmiller had been studying the pound situation for months. One crucial piece of analysis had come from Scott Bessent, who was then running Soros's London office and would later become the United States Secretary of the Treasury. Bessent had been analyzing the UK housing market and noted something the headline economic numbers did not fully capture. Roughly 90% of British mortgages were tied to overnight interest rates. This was not the case in Germany or France, where fixed-rate mortgages were the norm. In Britain, every time the Bank of England raised rates to defend the pound, it was not an abstract monetary adjustment. It was an immediate, direct increase in the monthly payment of almost every homeowner in the country. The economic pain of high rates was unusually concentrated and unusually tangible in British society. This was a government under extraordinary popular pressure. Pressure that would mount with every passing month, every repossession notice, every factory closure. The pound could not hold. And Druckenmiller's analysis made him confident of that to a degree of 95% probability in the next 3 months. He went to Soros with a position of roughly $1.5 billion short on the pound, essentially a bet that the pound would fall. Soros looked at him with an expression somewhere between amusement and disdain and told him to think bigger. There is a famous account of this conversation in Sebastian Mallaby's book, More Money Than God. When Druckenmiller laid out his thesis and his proposed position size, Soros reportedly said something to the effect of, "If you love it that much, why are you only doing half of it?" He pushed Druckenmiller to size the position to the full scale of the fund and then beyond, using borrowed money, using leverage, going for the jugular. Druckenmiller would later reflect that this lesson, that conviction without scale is a wasted opportunity, was perhaps the most valuable thing he ever learned from Soros. But the final catalyst for the timing of the attack came from an unexpected source. On the evening of September 15th, 1992, Helmut Schlesinger, the president of the Bundesbank, gave an interview to a journalist. He believed he was speaking off the record. He suggested that a broader realignment of European currencies might be necessary, that 1 or 2 more currencies might come under pressure beyond the Italian lira, which had already been forced to devalue. The quote was published anyway, attributed directly to him, and its implication was unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read it. The head of the Bundesbank, the anchor of the entire ERM system, was signaling that the pound might go next. Druckenmiller saw the report and immediately recognized its significance. He went to Soros. The moment had arrived. They had been building a $1.5 billion short position over the summer. Overnight, on September 15th, and into the early hours of September 16th, they scaled it to $10 billion. They borrowed pounds from anyone who would lend them, sold them for Deutschmarks, and waited for the pound to fall so they could buy the pounds back at a lower price, repay their loans, and pocket the difference. It was the largest currency bet ever made by a single private investor in history, and they were not alone. Word spread quickly through the interconnected world of global hedge funds. Other managers saw what Soros was doing and piled in behind him. The wave was building. The morning of September 16th, 1992 began under a low, grey London sky. Inside the Bank of England and the Treasury, officials were already aware that the pound was under pressure. Throughout the summer, the currency had been trading uncomfortably close to its ERM floor of 2.77 Deutsche Marks. The reserves had been quietly bleeding as the bank intervened to prop it up. At 8:30 in the morning, before most British citizens had finished their breakfast, the Bank of England purchased £300 million in a single block, attempting to push the currency higher. The pound barely moved. They purchased another £300 million. Again, the market absorbed it and kept selling. By this point, currency traders worldwide were dumping sterling at a rate that the Bank of England could not match. It was buying up to £2 billion per hour, more than it had ever purchased in a single day in its entire history, and the rate kept falling with almost every purchase. At 10:30 in the morning, the British government announced that interest rates were being raised from 10% to 12%, 2% in one morning. This was the financial equivalent of a distress flare. The market read it for exactly what it was, not a confident assertion of strength, but a desperate act by a government that had run out of options. Currency traders redoubled their selling. Then came the moment that still staggers the imagination. In the early afternoon, the British government announced that interest rates would be raised again, this time to 15%. 15%. In a country where millions of families had mortgages tied to overnight rates. In a country where unemployment was approaching 10%. In a country deep in recession. 15% interest rates would have been economically catastrophic. And everyone in the market knew that no democratic government could sustain them for more than hours. Across the Atlantic, Soros and Druckenmiller watched this with something approaching quiet amazement. The rate hike to 15% was not a sign of strength. It was a man drowning, flailing. Druckenmiller described it in interviews years later as the signal that the end was finally, definitively at hand. They did not sell more pounds. They had already committed everything they had. They simply waited. At 7 in the evening, Chancellor of the Exchequer Norman Lamont walked out to face the cameras and the microphones outside the Treasury. He announced that Britain was withdrawing from the exchange rate mechanism. The pound would be allowed to float freely. The government had spent an estimated £3.3 billion in foreign currency reserves trying to defend it. Every penny had been lost. The pound immediately fell 15% against the Deutsche Mark and 25% against the United States dollar. The quantum fund's position had just paid off. Soros's profit on the trade, buying back the pounds he had sold short at a dramatically lower price, was over £1 billion, more than $1 billion. in one day, from a modest Manhattan office with duct tape on the floor. Back in Britain, Norman Lamont's political career was effectively over. John Major's government had been destroyed, not immediately, but irreversibly. The Conservative Party, which had spent years cultivating a reputation as the natural managers of the British economy, had, in a single afternoon, been exposed as having made a catastrophic strategic error, and having been defeated in open battle not by a foreign power but by a private citizen with a theory about market psychology. The Conservatives would not return to power for 18 years. That is not a side note. That is one of the longest periods of opposition in British political history, triggered in large part by the events of one day. But let us talk about what Black Wednesday meant to the people who weren't managing billion-dollar hedge funds. Because the story tends to get told from the perspective of high finance, and in doing so, it leaves out the human terrain on which all of this played out. By September 1992, unemployment across the United Kingdom had already climbed to 9.9%. The housing market had been in free fall for nearly 2 years. In London and the southeast of England, which had experienced the most extreme surge in house prices during the boom of the late 1980s, hundreds of thousands of families were in negative equity. They had bought homes at the peak, financed by mortgages that seemed manageable when rates were 6 or 7%, and now found those mortgages eating up terrifying proportions of their incomes as rates climbed to defend the pound. Repossessions were rising sharply. The images of families packing their belongings into vans, surrendering keys to bank branches, were a recurring feature of the British news in those years. When the pound left the ERM and interest rates were immediately cut back from 15% to 10% and then lower in the months that followed, some of this pressure began to ease. In that sense, Black Wednesday, though catastrophic for the government's credibility, was paradoxically the thing that eventually released the economy from the trap it had been caught in. Over the next several years, lower interest rates allowed the housing market to stabilize, allowed businesses to invest again, allowed the Bank of England to pursue monetary policy appropriate for actual British economic conditions rather than those required to shadow the German economy. Norman Lamont famously remarked, months after the crisis, that he had been singing in his bath after the pound left the ERM. It was a remark that destroyed whatever was left of his political reputation, but he was, in a narrow economic sense, not entirely wrong. The years that followed Black Wednesday saw the longest sustained period of British economic growth since the Second World War. 16 consecutive years of expansion between the end of the 1991 downturn and the financial crisis of 2008. But none of that was visible in the immediate aftermath. What was visible was a government humiliated, a currency crashed, 3.3 billion pounds of public money spent and lost, workers still facing an uncertain job market, homeowners still struggling, a country that had been promised that membership of the ERM would deliver stability and prosperity, and had instead been delivered one of the most embarrassing monetary crises in post-war history. And the man who had engineered it from a modest Manhattan office had made $1 billion. It is worth pausing at this point to think carefully about whether what Soros did was right or wrong. It is a question he himself has engaged with, and his answer, which is characteristically nuanced, is worth examining. Soros has consistently argued that he did not cause the crisis. He identified and profited from a structural flaw, an overvalued currency pegged at an unsustainable rate by a government unwilling or unable to make the necessary adjustment that would have eventually collapsed regardless of whether the Quantum Fund had ever taken a position. The pound was not going to stay in the ERM at 2.95 marks. That was not a matter of speculation. It was a matter of arithmetic. The British government had joined the ERM at the wrong rate, at the wrong time, and had refused to accept the reality that the situation demanded a devaluation. Soros simply made money from that inevitable correction, and in doing so, accelerated it. This argument has genuine force. The pound would have left the ERM eventually. The only question was how much of British reserves would be burned in the attempt to prevent it. In a perverse sense, by forcing the issue decisively in September 1992, Soros may have shortened the duration of the torment, even as he took $1 billion out of the system in the process. But there is another reading, one that is harder to dismiss. At the time of the crisis, millions of British families were tied to that exchange rate whether they knew it or not. Their mortgage payments, their jobs, the interest rates their small businesses borrowed at. All of these were shaped by the policy that was being defended. A private actor, however sophisticated and however correct in his analysis, was making decisions at enormous scale, using borrowed money, that had direct, immediate consequences for people who had no say in the matter and no understanding of the forces acting upon them. This is what Soros's former colleague Robert Johnson gestured at when he reflected on the trade in later interviews. He said, "What is this, when small groups of people can take on large governments and prevail in this open, deregulated capital market system?" It is not a comfortable question. And the fact that the British government was wrong does not make the question go away. There's a further dimension to this. The deregulation of capital controls across the ERM bloc, required by the Single European Act of 1986 and fully implemented by 1990, had removed a crucial buffer. In the earlier years of the ERM, capital controls had made it difficult for enormous sums of money to move instantaneously between currencies in response to speculative pressure. The removal of those controls opened the floodgates. Private capital, organized, leveraged, globally mobile, could now move faster and in greater volume than any central bank could match. Black Wednesday was, in a very real sense, the first demonstration of what that meant in practice. The true legacy of September 16th, 1992, is not the $1 billion Soros made, it is the proof of concept it provided. Governments could be defeated by markets, not gradually, not through decades of slow erosion, but in a single day. A currency that a sovereign government had committed its credibility to defending could be broken in under 12 hours by a coordinated private assault. The world, after Black Wednesday, was a world in which that knowledge was common currency among every hedge fund, every sovereign wealth fund, every major bank trading desk on the planet. In the years that followed, the lesson was applied again and again. In 1997, a series of Asian currencies, the Thai baht, the Malaysian ringgit, the South Korean won, were attacked and broken in similar fashion, with devastating consequences for millions of people across Southeast Asia. Entire economies were restructured at the demand of the International Monetary Fund. Political instability followed. In Malaysia, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad explicitly blamed Soros for the destruction, calling him a menace. Soros denied it. The argument was never fully resolved. What was resolved, beyond any reasonable doubt, was the fundamental power dynamic. Private capital, intelligently organized and sufficiently concentrated, had demonstrated that it could do something that would have seemed impossible to most people before September 1992. It could override the decisions of elected governments on matters of fundamental economic policy. The transformation of George Soros himself in the years following Black Wednesday is one of the more complex chapters of this story. Having made more money than almost any human being had ever made in a single day, Soros did not retreat to a yacht or a private island. He became one of the most active philanthropists in the world. His Open Society foundations, which he had begun building in 1979 when he gave scholarships to black South Africans under apartheid, expanded dramatically. He funded dissident movements across Eastern Europe as communism collapsed. He donated to universities in Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. He contributed to journalism, public health, criminal justice reform, and civil society organizations in over 100 countries. By 2017, he had transferred $18 billion of his personal fortune to the foundations, making his total giving to that organization over $32 billion. As a share of his net worth, Forbes called him the most generous living donor in the world. None of this erases the questions raised by the pound trade. If anything, it complicates them in interesting ways. A man who profited enormously from the vulnerability of a nation's monetary system and then devoted an enormous portion of that profit to building democratic institutions around the world does not fit comfortably into any simple moral category. He is not a villain. He is not a hero. He is something more interesting than either a figure whose life and career illuminate structural features of the global financial system that are genuinely troubling, regardless of what you think of him personally. There's also the question of legacy in terms of what the Quantum Fund built. Over the nearly 30 years that Soros managed outside money, from 1970 through 2000, the fund delivered average annual returns of over 31%. An initial investment of $1,000 in 1969 would have grown to $4 million by the time he retired from managing outside money in 2011. This is a performance record that has never been matched at that scale, over that duration, by any other investment manager in history. In January 2014, investment tracker LCH Investments ranked Soros as the top performing hedge fund manager of all time, having generated total gains of approximately $42 billion for investors since the launch of his quantum fund in 1973. By way of comparison, this is more than the GDP of many sovereign nations. And at the center of that performance record, the crown jewel, the trade that defined everything, remained September 16th, 1992. The institutional aftermath of Black Wednesday reshaped British finance and politics in ways that are still being felt today. One of the most significant changes was the decision, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, to grant the Bank of England a formal inflation target, a shift away from the ERM's exchange rate anchor to a domestic price stability target. This laid the groundwork for the full independence of the Bank of England that arrived in 1997 under Tony Blair, when the newly elected Labour government handed control of interest rates directly to the bank's Monetary Policy Committee, removing them permanently from political control. This was perhaps the most durable structural reform to emerge from the wreckage of Black Wednesday. The lesson the British state drew was that monetary policy should not be subject to political pressure, that the kind of commitment credibility problem that had trapped John Major, the inability to raise rates when needed or cut them when needed because political calculations interfered with economic ones, could only be resolved by removing the political calculation entirely. The Bank of England today is the product of that lesson. Britain also never joined the euro. The psychological and political scarring of Black Wednesday made the idea of once again locking sterling into a fixed exchange rate with continental European currencies, especially a genuinely irreversible one, without even the theoretical option of withdrawal, essentially impossible to sell to the British public or to large parts of the British political class. When Tony Blair considered joining the euro in the early 2000s, the memory of 1992 was one of the most powerful arguments against it. And when the United Kingdom eventually voted to leave the European Union entirely in 2016, a vote driven by many factors, some economic, some cultural, some political, the ghost of Black Wednesday haunted the conversation. Margaret Thatcher's famous aphorism still echoed, "If you try to buck the market will buck you." Decades on from the events of September 1992, the fundamental question that Black Wednesday raised has not been resolved. It has only sharpened. Financial markets are bigger now than they were in 1992. The daily trading volume in global foreign exchange markets has grown from approximately $1 trillion per day in 1992 to over $7.5 trillion per day today. The mechanisms for organizing and deploying private capital have grown more sophisticated, more interconnected, and in some respects more opaque. The deregulation of capital flows that made the Black Wednesday trade possible has been extended and deepened across the global economy. Against this backdrop, a single hedge fund's ability to move a currency is arguably less decisive than it was in 1992. The market is simply too large for any one actor to dominate in the way that Soros dominated sterling that Wednesday. But the underlying dynamic, the tension between the commitments that elected governments make to their citizens about economic management and the capacity of mobile private capital to punish those commitments when they are deemed unsustainable, has not gone away. It has, if anything, intensified. Every time a government announces that it will defend a currency peg, or maintain a fixed exchange rate, or guarantee a certain fiscal trajectory, it is implicitly inviting markets to test whether the commitment is credible. And markets, always searching for the divergence between stated intention and economic reality, will eventually test it. The lesson of September 16, 1992 is that when the test comes, governments do not always pass. George Soros has said, in various formulations over the years, that he did not break the pound. He simply recognized that it was already broken. The government had made an unsustainable promise. He bet on the inevitability of reality reasserting itself over political commitment. He was right. He got paid for being right. The much harder question, who pays when governments make promises they cannot keep, and what kind of world is built when private capital has the power to enforce that reckoning at a time of its own choosing, that question belongs to all of us. It is still open. And it may be the most important question in economics that we have not yet found a satisfying answer to. In the meantime, the man who asked it most forcefully still has his name. The man who survived Hitler's occupation, who fled Soviet communism, who worked as a railway porter and a nightclub waiter, who studied philosophy at the knee of one of the century's great thinkers, who built a theory of markets out of a theory of human fallibility, and who sat in a modest Manhattan office and brought the Bank of England to its knees, his name was George Soros. And whatever you think of what he did, you will not find a more consequential single day in the history of modern finance. If you've made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you watching. Stories like this one, where economics, philosophy, and power collide in ways that change the world, are what this channel is all about. If you found this valuable, please do subscribe and leave a comment telling me what you found most surprising about this story. And if you're interested in the larger world of elite finance and the dynasties that shaped it, check out the other videos on this channel. There's a lot more where this came from. Thanks for being here.